Back in early 2020, it felt like the whole world just stopped. We were all facing the exact same threat, one single new coronavirus. But what happened next was anything but the same for everyone. Some countries seemed to crush the curve, while others, well, they were crushed by it. So how is that possible? One virus, but so many different outcomes. In this explainer, we're going to try to decode the pandemic playbook and figure that out. I mean, just take a look at this. This data from March of 2021 is pretty staggering. The United States isn't just leading the pack in confirmed cases here. It is in a totally different league, just dwarfing countries like Germany and Australia. And what's really wild is that India, with 4 times the population, had way fewer deaths at this point. The source material actually calls this a remarkable discrepancy, which honestly feels like a huge understatement. This isn't just a chart, it's a real mystery. And that, right there, is the big question we're going to tackle. If the biological threat was the same for everybody, what was going on behind the scenes? What about the politics, the culture, the history that led to these completely different outcomes? Let's unpack it. Okay, so to really get a handle on the differences, we've got to start with what was the same for everybody. It's so important to remember that when this crisis hit, every single government, from Washington to Seoul, was basically looking at the same fundamental set of tools to fight back. The best way to think about it is like a universal toolkit for a pandemic. Every leader could choose to roll out testing, but they had to decide, right? Do we test everyone or just focus on the hotspots? They could put limits on mobility, but should it be a mandatory national lockdown or just a strong suggestion to stay home? Border controls, contact tracing, masks, all of these were options on the table. See, the tools were all the same. The real difference was who was using them and how, and maybe most importantly, when they decided to pull them out of the box. And that leads us right into our first huge variable, governance. Because when a crisis this big hits, the question of who's in charge suddenly becomes the most important question there is. A country's command structure can literally be the difference between a fast, coordinated response and, well, a complete mess. So when you look at it, you basically see 2 main playbooks emerge. On one hand, you've got the centralized command model. This is where the national government really takes the reins, making quick, top-down decisions for the whole country. The goal is coordination and speed, and South Korea is a perfect example. On the other hand, you've got the decentralized response. Here, the power is spread out. Decisions are made by states or regions or even independent agencies, and that can lead to a more fragmented patchwork strategy, which is kind of what we saw in places like the United States and Sweden. All right, let's dig into that centralized model first, because South Korea's early response is now a global case study in just how effective top-down crisis management can really be. And wow, this graph tells the story perfectly. You see that terrifying first spike back in February, centered in the city of Daegu? Well, a centralized national response was mobilized almost immediately. And the result? Just look, within about a month, they wrestled that outbreak back under control. They flattened the curve, and they flattened it fast. This wasn't just luck. This was a system firing on all cylinders. Now, it's really important to get this right. Centralized doesn't just mean one person at the top calling all the shots. South Korea used what they call a whole community approach. Yeah, there was amazing cooperation between the central and local governments. But even better, the system was built to listen to good ideas no matter where they came from. That brilliant idea for drive-through testing, it came from doctors on the front lines. Residential treatment centers to take the pressure off hospitals, that was proposed by medical experts, and private companies jumped in to offer up their buildings. It was this incredible mix of strong central direction and massive buy-in from everyone else. Okay, so that's the top-down, all-in approach. Now let's look at a totally different story, the path taken in the United States, which was pretty much decentralized from day one. And this quote from our source material really hits the nail on the head. Instead of creating one national strategy, the federal government essentially passed the ball to the 50 state governors. That one decision basically set the stage for a decentralized and, as we'll see, a very fragmented response. And this led straight to what researchers call the patchwork problem. So instead of one American response, you ended up with 50. You'd have one state with a super strict mask mandate right next to a state with none at all. The rules on travel and business closures were a total mess of contradictions. And then basic public health advice got all tangled up in partisan politics. And the result of all that? Well, a virus doesn't stop at the state line, right? The lack of a single unified plan led to these rolling waves of infection that just moved from one part of the country to the next. But the US wasn't the only place with a decentralized response. Let's talk about Sweden, which is a really fascinating and pretty unique example of an agency-led approach. And for them, it's something that's baked right into their system of government. Okay, so how does this actually work? Well, in Sweden, the government ministries themselves are pretty small. The real power and know-how is in these 341 constitutionally independent agencies. When the pandemic hit, that meant the Public Health Agency was in the driver's seat. And their strategy was all about voluntary recommendations, not strict top-down rules. Because that agency is independent, the elected government pretty much followed its lead. And that explains why Sweden's response, with no hard lockdowns, looked so different from its neighbors. So the very structure of their government basically dictated the kind of policy they were going to have. Okay, so we've established that the chain of command is a huge deal. But here's the thing. Policies, whether they're centralized or not, don't just happen in a vacuum. So now we've got to talk about the invisible stuff. Things like a country's resources and its culture that really determine if a plan is going to work or just fall flat. And this is maybe the biggest takeaway here. A policy is really just a blueprint. If you don't have the skilled builders, that is, the administrative capacity, and you don't have a solid foundation, the social fabric, then that blueprint is just a piece of paper. Let's kick things off with what we call administrative capacity. And this chart is super revealing. So take Japan. You might think of Japan as having this really powerful state bureaucracy, but look at the actual numbers. Government employment is only 5.9% of the workforce. That's way below average. Now, during the pandemic, that's not just a number on a chart. That translated to real-world problems. Not enough staff in the health ministry, not enough capacity for testing, and a shortage of ICU beds. They just didn't have the state resources in place to launch the kind of response they really needed to. Okay, now for the social side of things. There's this key idea called communitarian citizenship. What does that mean? It's a worldview where people really see their own personal safety as being deeply tied to the health of their entire community. Basically, it's a perspective that puts a high value on the common good, sometimes even over the idea of absolute individual freedom. And you could literally see this playing out in real time. In places with strong communitarian traditions, like South Korea and Thailand, compliance with things like wearing a mask was just incredibly high. And they often didn't even need strict rules to make it happen. In Thailand, the whole response was guided by medical experts, and pretty much everyone agreed to follow their advice. Now contrast that with what happened in the US and parts of Europe, where the exact same measures started these huge debates about individual liberty and personal rights. That cultural divide, it had a huge impact on how well any policy could actually work. All right, so we've got governance, and we've got culture. The last piece of this big puzzle is history, a nation's memory. How did past fights with diseases build up a kind of immunity, not just in people, but in the policies themselves? This timeline does a great job of showing what we call policy learning. Think about it. Countries in the Asia-Pacific had a kind of dress rehearsal with the SARS epidemic back in 2003. Then for South Korea, the MERS outbreak in 2015 was another really tough but really important lesson. That experience led them to make huge reforms. They beefed up their CDC, built better infection control networks, the whole 9 yards. So when COVID-19 showed up, they basically had a playbook ready to go. People were already aware, wearing a mask was no big deal, and the government was ready to act fast because they've learned the hard way. But for countries that didn't have that kind of recent, painful memory, the response often felt, well, out of sync. This slide shows a really interesting idea called complex time. The idea is pretty simple, actually. In a huge, decentralized country like the US, it's like everyone is on a different clock. New York sees the danger and reacts in March. Texas might not feel that same urgency until May, and maybe another state waits until July. The problem is, when you're up against a virus that's doubling every few days, those delays are devastating. The country just wasn't moving as one because it wasn't seeing the threat as one. So, when you put it all together, what's the big picture? A pandemic, it turns out, isn't just a test of a country's hospitals. It's like a massive stress test for an entire country. It tests your whole governance structure. Are you decisive or divided? It tests your systems. Do you have the people and resources to get things done? And maybe most importantly, it tests your social fabric. Is there enough trust and unity to act together for the good of everyone? Look, the different results we saw across the globe weren't random. They weren't just bad luck. They were the direct result of these really deep factors: governance, culture, and history. The pandemic was like a brutal pop quiz for the entire planet. And that leaves us with one really important question. Now that we've seen the answer key, are we going to be ready for the retain?